Hi, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about synthesis and how this is going to be important for your proposal essay. So, there are really three main types of writing that you're going to do in college. And this final essay you're working on is going to incorporate all three of those things. We've talked about the first two quite a bit. So, one of those is summary. This shouldn't be the bulk of the paper that you're doing, but you're going to have to summarize some of this information that you're finding, since your audience has not read these articles that you have. Another type of writing that's going to be important here, that you've practiced before, is analysis. You're going to analyze what some of these articles are saying and try to break down kind of what their main arguments are and what you think of those arguments. So the one I really want to get into in this video is synthesis, and you're going to read more about this in the learning activity. But to synthesize means to bring together, and that's exactly what you're doing in any type of research assignment. You're pulling information from all of these different sources that you found and combining it with what you want to say about this topic. That can be kind of hard the more information you're bringing in. In a paper where you're going to have 7 sources, it can feel kind of hard to manage that amount of information. But one of your primary jobs in this paper is to act as a connector. How are you going to make all of these different pieces of information that you found fit together and support this one idea that you're trying to get across in your thesis? That's kind of the struggle here. So, I think you're probably at the stage where you found some articles, maybe you've read them a little bit, but I think now you need to get more into these articles, start taking notes and figuring out where you're going to put things in your paper. So one thing that might help is, as you're reading through these articles and taking notes on them, it probably makes sense to group similar ideas or similar types of articles together. And probably what that means is, in your paper, if you have a couple articles on a similar subject, those should probably go one right after the other in the paper. It wouldn't make sense to put this article much later if it's pretty close to another article, right? So a lot of what you're doing is thinking about comparing and contrasting some of these sources that you found. Any that have similar ideas, like we said, it probably makes sense to put them closer together than other things, because you want to be thinking about what's the most logical order to present this information that I found. So I think what you really need to do is take some good notes on each of these articles that you found, because that's just going to make it easier to get going on the drafting. So what you probably want to do is, whether you're doing this in a Microsoft Word document or just doing this on a sheet of paper, give a little bit of summary of the article. And these abstracts that the database articles have should help you out a little bit with that. We'll kind of summarize each source and kind of take note of your responses, like specifically, why is this article important, or what does it have to do with the point that I'm trying to make? Because again, if you jot that stuff down, it's going to be easier for you to create paragraphs. And really, I think with this type of paper, you kind of need to be strategic about that. So you guys know that this paper needs to be a minimum of 8 pages. So, just strategy-wise, if you're thinking about it, most of the time a paragraph's pretty close to like half a page long, maybe a little longer, maybe a little shorter. So what that means is you can sort of estimate that this paper will be about 16 paragraphs, right? If it's an 8-page paper, let's just say as an estimate, maybe that means you need 16 paragraphs. You're going to have an intro paragraph, you're going to have a conclusion paragraph. So that number is probably going to drop down to about 14 or so paragraphs where you're bringing in content stuff, right? So when you're taking notes and going through these articles, think about it as building paragraphs. I'm going to build a paragraph around this information. I'm going to build a paragraph around this other information. And again, the thing is, you don't have to just quote from an article one time. You know, if it makes a couple or a few interesting points, you can do a couple or several paragraphs all about the one article before you move on, right? So I just wanted to show you maybe an example of how you might do this on like a small scale. And all I'm doing here is kind of taking notes. But I can use this stuff to create paragraphs of my paper later. So I just came up with a sample research question that I put at the top here. And it might be good when you're taking notes to have your research question in front of you so you don't forget what it is you're trying to look at. It's very easy to kind of veer off into another subject when you're looking at a bunch of articles. So if you have that research question in front of you, you'll always make sure to stay focused. Like, how does this article relate to this particular question I want to answer? So, you know, the sample question that I came up with was, do parents have different hopes and standards for their sons than for their daughters? Because again, if I were doing a proposal essay, you know, maybe I would argue that this is a problem when parents kind of treat their sons and daughters differently, and that impacts sort of how successful they are later in life, right? But again, I'm posing it as a question to see if my research can help me answer this, okay? So, and again, I really went and found a couple of articles in the databases that relate to this question. So the first one I found, I kind of put the citation, the works cited entry for it here. And it's an article by these people, and it's called The Effect of a Child's Sex on Support for Traditional Gender Roles. So let's look at the abstract. And again, these abstracts that you have in the databases are really good at kind of simplifying what the article is going to be about. But it says, in this article, they examine whether the sex of a child affects parents' beliefs about traditional gender roles. Using an improved methodological approach that explicitly analyzes the natural experiment versus differences in differences, we find that having a daughter versus having a son causes men to reduce their support for traditional gender roles, but a female child has no such effect among women, representing less than 4% of the size of the standard deviation of the attitude scale. And again, even some of the language here in the abstract is a little tough, and you know, if we read the full article, we'd probably have even better understanding of what's being said. But again, in general, what it's saying is when people, specifically men, believe in traditional gender roles, this idea that men should do certain stuff and women should do certain stuff, and that's just how it is, that depending on what sex of child they have, it may change their views on these gender roles. And specifically, if they have boys, they may not change their minds about gender roles. But when they have little girl children, they do tend to change and instead start to think of boys and girls more equally. And again, what's kind of interesting here is that women don't really change their views much at all. So it doesn't matter whether they have a boy or a girl, they tend to feel the same about gender roles. And that could be for several different reasons, right? So what I want to do, once I found this article that seems like it might work for my paper, I just take some notes on it, and specifically kind of jotting down some of these important points. So the first thing I said is just kind of like summarizing what the point of the article is. Men specifically have different standards for boys versus girls depending on what their child's sex is. So like we said, if they have a little girl child, they start to believe less in this idea of traditional gender roles, but if they have a boy, they may kind of stick to those traditional gender roles. Again, I kind of explain this a little bit more. When men have boy children, they're more supportive of these traditional roles. But when they have girls, they're less supportive. So then I found a specific quote that I thought was pretty good that kind of explains this, right? Prior to having a daughter, many women may have already crossed a threshold of exposure to gender issues beyond which we hypothesize that more exposure may have little effect. And I kind of added some more there. So the thing is, when you bring in a quote from your article, you want to explain it because it might not be immediately obvious to your audience. Again, a lot of these articles probably have pretty sophisticated language, so you want to simplify it for your audience, right? So I kind of just jotted down here in the bullet points. So what does this mean, this quote? It means that men may not have experienced the negative consequences of traditional gender roles like women have, so it takes having a daughter to make them understand how these roles limit girls. And again, that's kind of what the quote is explaining. So then I always want to kind of jot down, so why does this matter? How does this article have value for my paper? Because again, this is something you probably want to explicitly say in the paragraph. Otherwise, the audience isn't going to see what this has to do with your point. So again, I would want to look back at my question. Do parents have different hopes and standards for their sons than for their daughters? And talk about how this article answers that question. So why does this matter for my paper? It seems like the response to my question is, it depends. Yes and no. While fathers who have daughters may end up treating them equally to their sons, fathers who only have sons may pass on their traditional gender role beliefs to them, which might impact how they treat women in their lives, maybe in a negative way, right? So again, that explanation, here's why it matters, that's really going to help the audience see what this article is doing for your paper, right? So again, I found another article, and again, just in the interest of time, we won't read all of this, but essentially, this article was saying that parents treat their male and female children differently depending on what their class status is. And specifically, high class or upper class families put more investment or energy into boy children, but interestingly, lower class families put more energy and effort into raising their girl children than boy children. That's like an interesting point. What it also said that was kind of interesting is that upper class families tend to have more boys than girls. And this is like a biological thing. Apparently, like when a mother is having a baby and the sex is not determined yet, that her womb and body has to be really like not without any stress, and like has to have certain conditions for her to have a boy. For a girl, her body can handle more stress. The girl's not as fragile as a boy, and so we can imagine that if somebody's from a lower class family, they probably are more stressed and have less ideal conditions, and so there just are more girl children in lower class families. That's just kind of like an interesting point. But again, I, would want to jot down some things like main points of the article, bringing in a particular quote that illustrates an interesting idea, and then say why it matters, right? So again, if we just kind of look at the what I included after the quote here. So what does this quote mean that I included? Depending on the financial status of the family you're born into, if you're the sex that this type of family does not invest as much in, you're not going to be as prepared for life as compared to your siblings. And again, adding like why this matters, it suggests that the answer to my research question is yes, kids are treated differently based on gender. And the sex who's less supported for that particular class status may not be as successful in life and may struggle more because their parents put all their energy into their other children. So again, this is just kind of an illustration of what you might do as you're going through your articles. And realistically, just by taking these notes, I've kind of built the paragraph that I'm going to write. So this might save you a lot of time when you're trying to actually get going on the drafting of your paper.